The morning of February 17th, 1944, 25 miles north of Truk Atoll, Caroline Islands, Lieutenant Commander Robert Anderson stands in the fire control tower of USS Iowa, hands steady on the plotting table despite what he's watching through the optical rangefinder. A Japanese light cruiser, Katori, is racing northwest at 28 knots, trailing black smoke, desperate to escape the ring of American steel tightening around Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific. Behind Anderson, the Mark 8 Rangekeeper, a mechanical brain of gears, cams, and gyroscopes hums and clicks, calculating a firing solution to a target more than 20 miles distant. A target the Japanese believe is beyond the effective range of any gun in the world. Admiral Raymond Spruance, aboard USS New Jersey nearby, has given the order, destroy any vessel attempting to flee. Anderson keys his headset. Main battery, prepare for surface action, target bearing 350, range 35,700 yards. That's over 20 miles, over the horizon, beyond what any naval gun had reliably struck in the history of warfare. The Mark 7 16-inch guns of Iowa begin their mechanical ballet turrets rotating with hydraulic precision, barrels elevating toward an angle that seems more suitable for artillery than naval combat. Each gun weighs 267,000 pounds. Each shell weighs as much as a small automobile. The Japanese captain of Katori has made a fatal miscalculation. His intelligence briefings, drawn from pre-war German naval assessments and Japan's own observations, suggested that while the Americans were building large battleships, these vessels represented the last gasps of an obsolete weapon system. Aircraft carriers had made battleships irrelevant at Pearl Harbor, at Midway, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Everyone knew this. The great German Admiral Erich Raeder had said so himself when Plan Z, Germany's ambitious naval expansion, prioritized U-boats and a handful of super battleships over quantity. The future of naval warfare, the thinking went, belonged to aircraft and submarines. But what the Japanese captain doesn't know, what almost no one outside the highest levels of Allied naval command fully understands, is that USS Iowa and her sisters represent something unprecedented. Battleships designed in the age of radar, equipped with fire control systems that can predict where a target will be in the 90 seconds it takes a shell to travel 24 miles, and accurate enough to place that shell within 100 yards of a point the crew has never seen with human eyes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Mark 8 Rangekeeper is solving an equation that would challenge a room full of mathematicians. Own ship speed, 30 knots. Target speed, estimated 28 knots. Wind speed and direction from the ship's anemometer. The roll and pitch of the ship from the Mark 41 stable vertical gyroscope. The rotation of the Earth beneath them. The curvature of the planet. The air temperature and density. The predicted muzzle velocity of each gun based on barrel wear. All of this data, flowing into a mechanical computer built before anyone had heard of digital electronics, generates a firing solution updated twice per second. This is the technological edge that separates Iowa from every battleship that came before. When Bismarck had sortied into the Atlantic in May 1941, her fire control systems were the finest Germany could produce: optical rangefinders with 12-meter bases, mechanical computers to calculate deflection. But Bismarck could only fire accurately at what her crew could see, and in the North Atlantic's notorious weather that limited her to ranges under 20,000 yards in good conditions, far less in the storms and mists that shrouded those waters. When aircraft from HMS Ark Royal crippled her steering, it was over. The battleship, for all her armour and firepower, had been rendered helpless by a handful of obsolete swordfish biplanes carrying torpedoes. That engagement had confirmed what Billy Mitchell had demonstrated 2 decades earlier when he sank the captured German battleship Ostfriesland with bombers. Battleships were vulnerable to air attack. The prophecy seemed fulfilled at Taranto in November 1940, when British carrier aircraft devastated the Italian fleet in harbour. Then came Pearl Harbor, where aircraft sank or damaged 8 American battleships without a single Japanese surface ship entering Hawaiian waters. And Midway, where 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the pride of the combined fleet, went to the bottom, destroyed by American dive bombers, while the battleships Yamato and Nagato steamed uselessly hundreds of miles away. By 1944, the verdict seemed clear to naval strategists worldwide. The age of the battleship was over. The Kriegsmarine had learned this lesson bitterly. Plan Z, approved by Hitler in January 1939, had called for 6 massive H-class battleships mounting 8 20-inch guns, each ships that would dwarf even Iowa. But when war came in September 1939, only a fraction of Plan Z had been completed. Germany possessed just 2 modern battleships, Bismarck and Tirpitz, and the Scharnhorst-class battlecruisers. Their sole aircraft carrier, Graf Zeppelin, sat 85% complete in a German shipyard but would never enter service. German naval priorities had shifted to U-boats, the weapons that could actually threaten Britain's lifeline across the Atlantic. The German Naval Staff's assessment of battleships, circulated in internal documents in 1940 and 41, was pragmatic and dark. Battleships were prestige weapons, useful for propaganda and for tying down enemy resources, but in modern warfare they were costly targets. When Bismarck went down in May 1941, hunted by dozens of British ships and aircraft after sinking HMS Hood, the lesson seemed confirmed. Tirpitz spent most of the war hiding in Norwegian fjords, a fleet in being that threatened convoys but rarely risked battle. Even this defensive strategy failed in November 1944, when British Lancaster bombers carrying tall-boy earthquake bombs finally sent her to the bottom. For the Japanese, the lesson was even more painful. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the world's 2 largest battleships, Yamato and Musashi, sortied as the center of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force. Musashi, bristling with 18-inch guns and carrying armor that could theoretically resist any shell afloat, absorbed 17 bomb hits and 20 torpedo hits from American carrier aircraft before capsizing. Yamato survived. Leyte but would meet her end 6 months later, in April 1945, on a suicide mission to Okinawa. Before she could reach the island, carrier aircraft from Task Force 58 swarmed her. She took at least 11 torpedo hits and 6 bomb hits before exploding and sinking, taking over 3,000 men with her. These were the cautionary tales in every admiral's mind in early 1944. Aircraft dominated the sea. Battleships were dinosaurs, magnificent but doomed, unable to defend themselves against a determined air attack and incapable of projecting power beyond the range of their guns, typically 15 to 20 miles in ideal conditions. But here's what made Iowa and her 3 sisters different, what made them something unprecedented in naval warfare. They weren't designed to rule the seas alone. They were designed to survive in a carrier-dominated environment while providing a capability no carrier could match. The Iowa-class battleships, Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin, were ordered in July 1939 and commissioned between February 1943 and April 1944. Their design parameters reflected lessons the U.S. Navy had learned from 2 decades of careful study. They needed to be fast 33 knots, fast enough to keep up with the Essex-class fleet carriers that would form the core of the fast carrier task forces. They needed to fit through the locks of the Panama Canal, restricting their beam to 108 feet, and they needed firepower sufficient to deal with any enemy ship they might encounter, which meant 9 16-inch guns as their main battery. But the true revolution in Iowa's design wasn't visible in her graceful lines or her imposing gun turrets. It was in her plotting rooms, deep below the waterline, inside the armoured citadel. There, behind steel plates up to 17 inches thick, sat the Mark 38 gunfire control system and the Mark 8 Rangekeeper, the mechanical brain that made Iowa the most accurate heavy gun platform ever built. The Rangekeeper was the product of decades of development by the Ford Instrument Company. It was an analog computer in the truest sense, mechanical representations of mathematical functions, solved not through calculations, but through the physical movements of gears, cams, and differentials. Feed it the correct inputs, and it would output the bearing and elevation needed to hit a moving target at ranges up to 42,000 yards, nearly 24 miles. Previous battleships had mechanical fire control computers, of course. The British had their Admiralty fire control tables. The Germans had sophisticated systems aboard Bismarck and Tirpitz. The Japanese Type 98 fire control system aboard Yamato was highly advanced. But all of these systems had fundamental limitations. They required multiple operators to feed in manual corrections. They couldn't easily integrate data from multiple sources. And critically, none of them could effectively use radar to continuously track and engage targets. The Mark 8 Rangekeeper could do all of this automatically. It received inputs from the Mark 38 Director, the optical and radar tracking station mounted atop the fire control tower. It received pitch and roll data from the Mark 41 Stable Vertical Gyroscope, which maintained a perfect reference to true level, regardless of the ship's motion. It received wind speed and direction from the ship's anemometers. It received the ship's course from her gyro compasses and her speed from her pitometer log, a device that measured water pressure to determine velocity through the water. All of this data flowed into the Rangekeeper through synchro transmitters, electric motors that could transmit angular position from one location to another with extraordinary precision. The Rangekeeper combined this information with manually entered data: air temperature, air density, the average muzzle velocity of the battery's guns, and continuously calculated the solution to hit the target. It compensated for gravity, wind resistance, the Magnus effect from the shell's spin, the curvature of the Earth, and the Coriolis effect from the planet's rotation. It predicted where the target would be at the end of the projectile's time of flight, often 90 seconds or more, and set the guns to fire at that future position. The system was so sophisticated that during the bombardment of Ponape Atoll in May 1944, Iowa was sighting on a reference point on the island and spotting fire from there. The ship then sailed out of sight of the target for 15 minutes, while the Director remained in auto-track mode, its radar locked on the reference point beyond visual range. When the reference point came back into view, the Rangekeeper's solution had drifted by just 100 yards of range and 0.0 to 5 degrees of bearing. The mechanical brain had maintained firing accuracy while navigating, maneuvering, and correcting for every variable, all without human intervention beyond the initial setup. This was possible because of the final component that made Iowa revolutionary: radar-directed fire control. The Mark 13 fire control radar, mounted on the main battery director, could accurately measure range to a battleship-sized target at over 40,000 yards, more than 22 miles. Unlike the meter-wavelength radars used by German and Japanese battleships, which could only provide rough bearing data and required optical directors for accurate aim, the Mark 13 operated at 10 centimeter wavelength. This gave it the angular accuracy to provide both range and bearing inputs, accurate enough for blind fire shooting at targets the crew could not see with their eyes, over the horizon, in darkness, through smoke, in storms. The British Royal Navy had this capability too, by 1943, and had demonstrated it to devastating effect in November 1942, when USS Washington used radar fire control to demolish the Japanese battlecruiser Kirishima at night off Guadalcanal. But the Americans had taken the technology further. The integration of radar with the Rangekeeper meant that Iowa could track multiple targets, update firing solutions in real time, and engage surface targets while simultaneously directing her 5-inch secondary battery against aircraft. None of the Axis powers achieved this level of automation. German fire control systems, sophisticated as they were, required optical tracking for bearing data. Japanese systems relied on averaging multiple optical rangefinders and required 7 operators to input manual corrections to their analog computers. In the chaos of battle, at night, in bad weather, or when shells were falling close enough to throw up waterspouts that obscured the target, these systems degraded quickly. American radar-directed fire control did not. This is what Lieutenant Commander Anderson is relying on as Iowa prepares to engage Katori. The target is beyond visual range over the horizon from the director's position. But the Mark 13 radar has a solid lock. The rangekeeper is tracking Katori's course and speed, predicting her position 90 seconds from now, adjusting for every variable in its mechanical memory. Anderson consults with the gunnery officer. The solution has stabilized. All 3 main battery turrets report ready. 9 16-inch Mark 7 guns, each 66 feet long from breech to muzzle, are loaded with 2,700-pound armor-piercing shells. Each shell is a pointed cylinder of steel, 4 feet tall, with a bursting charge of just 40 pounds of explosive. Most of its weight is solid steel, designed to penetrate the hardened armor of enemy battleships before detonating deep inside the target. Against an unarmored cruiser like Katori, a single hit will be catastrophic. Main battery, fire. The words are simple. The reality is apocalyptic. 9 guns fire in a rippling salvo, the slight delays between guns meant to prevent interference between shells in flight. The muzzle blast is visible from miles away, massive clouds of flame and smoke erupting from the turrets. The overpressure is so intense that it would kill anyone standing on deck nearby. The ship shudders, her bow pushed sideways by the physics of firing over 200,000 pounds of steel at over 2,500 feet per second. The concussion rolls across the water in visible waves. The shells are in flight. Time of flight to target at this range: approximately 90 seconds. Each shell is following a parabolic trajectory that will take it over 60,000 feet into the sky, more than 11 miles up before it arcs down toward the target. At the highest point of the trajectory, the shells are moving faster than the speed of sound, their passage creating a distinctive scream that observers miles away will later describe as sounding like freight trains crossing the sky. Aboard Katori, if anyone is tracking Iowa's position, they have about 60 seconds warning, 60 seconds to realize that shells are falling from the sky. Modern fire control directors with radar might plot the incoming rounds, might give the captain time to order evasive maneuvers. But Katori, commissioned in 1940, has no such systems. Her crew's first warning is the sound that terrible freight train scream growing louder. The salvos begin to fall. Towering water spouts erupt around Katori, white columns of seawater thrown hundreds of feet into the air by shells that miss by yards or dozens of yards. The pattern brackets the cruiser, straddling her, in naval gunnery terminology. Shells land on both sides, ahead and astern. This is exactly what the Rainkeeper predicted. This is a perfect first salvo at maximum range. In Iowa's fire control, observers with optical equipment and radar plot the fall of shot. The pattern is tight. The 9 shells have landed within a 300-yard area. Remarkable accuracy given the range and the variables involved. Spotters make minor corrections, feeding them into the Rangekeeper. Range, down 200 yards. Deflection, left 1 degree. The mechanical brain absorbs these inputs, recalculates, and updates the firing solution. Iowa fires again. This time the corrections are smaller. The bracket tightens. Katori, despite her helmsman's desperate maneuvers, violent turns that push the old cruiser to her structural limits, cannot escape the pattern. She is running out of sea room, out of time, out of luck. The 3rd salvo finds her. No one will ever know exactly how many shells hit, at least 2, possibly 4. Each shell weighs 2,700 pounds and is travelling at over 1,600 feet per second when it strikes. The impact effects are beyond description. Armor-piercing shells don't just penetrate, they pass through thin armor like paper and detonate deep inside the target. Katori's hull is split open. Internal bulkheads collapse. Steam lines rupture, filling compartments with superheated steam. Fuel bunkers are breached, and burning oil spreads through the ship. Magazine spaces flood to prevent explosions, but the flooding is uncontrollable, spreading throughout the hull. Within minutes, Katori is dead in the water, listing heavily, fires visible throughout her superstructure. New Jersey, Iowa's sister ship, adds her own 16-inch shells to the barrage. Cruisers and destroyers close in, adding 5-inch and 6-inch gunfire. The Japanese destroyer Maikaze, attempting to assist, is blown apart, The training cruiser, Akagi Maru, pressed into service as an auxiliary, is sunk. Katori capsizes and sinks at approximately 10:30 in the morning. The time from Iowa's first salvo to Katori's loss, less than 15 minutes. The range at which Iowa engaged, 35,700 yards over 20 miles, the record for the longest range straddle in naval history. This engagement, little remembered today outside naval history circles, demonstrated something that contradicted every assumption about battleship obsolescence. Here was Iowa, engaging and destroying a target beyond visual range, using radar and mechanical computers to achieve what had been impossible just 5 years earlier. No aircraft carrier could do this. Carrier aircraft had longer range, they could strike targets hundreds of miles away. But they required flight operations, launch and recovery cycles, weather conditions suitable for flight operations. They couldn't maintain continuous fire on a target. They couldn't engage through cloud cover or in the middle of a typhoon. Iowa could do all of these things. And she was just beginning to demonstrate her capabilities. The engagement at Truk was not an isolated incident. 2 months later, on March 18, 1944, Iowa and New Jersey bombarded Mealy Atoll in the Marshall Islands. The Japanese, having learned from Truk, had positioned coastal defense guns, heavy artillery pieces removed from Singapore after that fortress fell to the Japanese in February 1942. These were 8-inch and 6-inch naval guns, protected by concrete emplacements, manned by experienced crews. Iowa and New Jersey opened fire at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards over 10 miles. For 2 hours, they poured shells into the island's defenses. The Japanese guns remained silent, their crews waiting for the battleships to close to a range where return fire would be effective. But the Americans had no intention of closing. They could hit targets at ranges where the coastal guns couldn't reply. Finally, the Japanese opened fire. At 9:40 in the morning, a 6-inch shell struck Turret 2 on Iowa's port side. The hit failed to penetrate the armor. The shell simply burst against the 17.3-inch thick turret faceplate, destroying the left gun pointer's telescope and breaking the glass covering the turret's rangefinder. 2 men inside the turret suffered minor wounds from shrapnel that entered through the telescope opening. 15 minutes later, another 6-inch shell hit Iowa aft, near the 5-inch gun mounts. This shell punched a hole 30 inches by 50 inches in the ship's side plating, 4 feet below the main deck. It opened a void space and caused minor damage, but no casualties. These were the only hits Iowa took during the entire war, 2 6-inch shells that barely scratched her. In return, Iowa and New Jersey reduced Mealy Atoll's defenses to rubble, silencing the coastal guns and demolishing fortifications that had taken the Japanese 2 years to build. The mathematics of this exchange are instructive. The Japanese guns, firing at Iowa at ranges of 8 to 10,000 yards, achieved 2 hits out of dozens of shells fired, and those hits did negligible damage. Iowa, firing at ranges of 20,000 yards and beyond, achieved a hit rate sufficient to mission kill or destroy every target she engaged. The advantage wasn't just in armor or shell weight. It was in fire control, in the integration of radar and computers that allowed Iowa to hit what her enemies could only hope to strike. This is what separates Iowa and her sisters from every battleship that came before. And it's why the German and Japanese assessments of battleship obsolescence, while correct for most battleships, were catastrophically wrong when applied to the Iowa class. These ships weren't obsolete. They were revolutionary, the first battleships, designed from the keel up to fight in the age of radar, to integrate seamlessly with carrier task forces, to provide a capability that no other ship type could match. Consider what Iowa brought to the fast carrier task force. The Essex-class carriers, with their air groups of 90 aircraft each, could strike at ranges of 300 miles or more. But those aircraft needed hours to launch, fly to target, conduct their attack, and return. They needed good weather. They needed aviators to rest between missions. They couldn't maintain a continuous presence over a target area. And they were terribly vulnerable to enemy aircraft. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 would demonstrate this when Japanese aircraft managed to penetrate the American fighter screens and bomb several carriers, causing significant damage despite the complete failure of the Japanese attack overall. Iowa could engage targets continuously, in any weather, day or night, without pause. Her 9 16-inch guns could fire 2 rounds per gun per minute, sustaining this rate of fire for hours. That's 18 shells per minute, each weighing between 1,900 and 2,700 pounds. In 1 hour, Iowa could deliver over 1 million pounds of explosives on target, more than a squadron of heavy bombers could drop in multiple sorties, and delivered with the accuracy of a rifle shot at ranges up to 24 miles. And unlike the carriers, Iowa was almost immune to attack. Her armor scheme was designed to resist her own shells at battle ranges. Her belt armor, up to 12.1 inches thick, could stop any shell fired by any ship, except Yamato, at ranges over 20,000 yards. Her deck armor, up to 6 inches thick over the magazines and machinery spaces, could resist aerial bombs up to 16-inch armor-piercing shells converted to bombs and dropped from medium altitude. Her turret faces were 17.3 inches of Class B armor, impervious to anything smaller than a 16-inch gun. More importantly, she had the anti-aircraft firepower to defend herself and the carriers she escorted. Her secondary battery of 25-inch 38 caliber guns, mounted in 10 twin turrets, provided both anti-surface and anti-aircraft fire. These guns could engage aircraft at ranges up to 9 miles, firing shells with proximity fuses that detonated when they sensed a target nearby. For closer defense, Iowa mounted 80 quad-mounted 40mm Bofors guns and 49 20mm Oerlikon cannons. This wall of steel and fire was devastating. Between October 1944 and February 1945, the anti-aircraft batteries of the 4 Iowa-class battleships accounted for roughly half of all Japanese aircraft, shot down hundreds of planes destroyed before they could reach the carriers they were targeting. This combination offensive firepower that no aircraft could match at close range, defensive capabilities that allowed her to protect the carriers, and integration with the radar-directed air defense net that made the fast carrier task force deadly to any air attack made Iowa and her sisters indispensable, not obsolete. They were force multipliers, ships that made the entire task force more effective, more survivable, more capable of sustained operations. And there was one more role they filled, a role that only battleships could perform: shore bombardment in support of amphibious operations. The Pacific War was fundamentally an amphibious war. Island by island, the Americans advanced toward Japan, each landing requiring close fire support to suppress enemy defenses during the vulnerable hours when troops were wading ashore through surf and establishing beachheads. Aircraft could provide some of this support, but they couldn't maintain continuous fire, couldn't adjust rapidly to changing targets, and couldn't destroy hardened fortifications the way heavy naval guns could. Iowa supported amphibious operations at Kwajalein, Eniwetok, the Marianas, Peleliu, Leyte, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. At each invasion, she took station a few miles offshore and began systematic destruction of enemy positions. Her gunners worked from maps and photographs, from spotters in light aircraft circling overhead, from radio calls from Marines and soldiers on the beach who could see enemy fire and call down pinpoint naval gunfire. The effect of 16-inch shells on Japanese fortifications was apocalyptic. The high explosive shells, 1,900-pounders with 800 pounds of explosive filler, would create a crater 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep on impact. The blast would defoliate trees 400 yards away. Concrete bunkers that could resist 500-pound bombs would simply disappear under 16-inch fire. Caves dug into hillsides would collapse, entombing their garrisons. Artillery positions would be obliterated, not just the guns destroyed, but the crews killed, the ammunition blown up, the position rendered useless. This was firepower that no aircraft could match. Carrier bombers could deliver bombs weighing up to 2,000 pounds, but they couldn't do it continuously, couldn't adjust fire in real time, and couldn't maintain the relentless, systematic destruction that naval gunfire provided. The Japanese certainly understood this. In after-action reports captured after the war, Japanese commanders consistently identified naval gunfire as one of the most devastating aspects of American amphibious operations. One report from Saipan noted that a single battleship's fire had destroyed an entire regiment's command post, killed the regimental commander and his staff, and knocked out 6 artillery batteries, all in less than an hour. Another report from Iwo Jima estimated that over half of the Japanese casualties during the first 3 days of battle came from naval gunfire, not from marine rifles or aircraft. This is the context in which Iowa's true capabilities must be understood. She wasn't obsolete. She was purpose-built for modern warfare, fast enough to operate with carriers, powerful enough to engage any surface target, accurate enough to hit those targets at ranges where return fire was impossible, armored enough to survive anything short of multiple hits from the largest guns afloat, and equipped with fire control systems that made her the most accurate heavy gun platform ever built. The Germans called battleships obsolete. They were right for most battleships. But they never encountered an Iowa class, never faced the combination of radar-directed fire control and 16-inch guns that could reach out over the horizon. If Bismarck had faced Iowa in the Denmark Strait instead of Hood, if the engagement had occurred at night or in fog where Bismarck's optical fire control was useless and Iowa's radar could see clearly, the outcome would have been different. Iowa could have engaged from ranges where Bismarck couldn't reply, in conditions where Bismarck couldn't see her target. Iowa's fire control was so advanced that during her modernization in the 1980s, test firings demonstrated that she could hit a tank-sized target at ranges exceeding 42,000 yards, with better than a 50% hit probability on the first shot, and with all 9 guns firing at the same target, a better than 99.9% probability of destruction. This is the story of how the last battleships became the best battleships, how American engineering and ingenuity took what everyone believed was an obsolete weapon system and transformed it into something that remained relevant for 5 decades, fighting in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Lebanon, and the Persian Gulf. It's the story of the Iowa-class battleships, and it begins with understanding that what the Germans called obsolete, the Americans made revolutionary. The development of Iowa and her sisters was not inevitable. It was the product of careful planning, bitter lessons, and the recognition that the United States would need ships capable of fighting in the Pacific vast distances, hostile waters, and enemies who would stop at nothing. The story begins in July 1939, when the keel of USS Iowa was laid down at the New York Naval shipyard. The timing was not coincidental. War had not yet begun in Europe, but American naval planners had been watching Japan's expansion in China and Germany's increasingly aggressive posture with growing alarm. The Second London Naval Treaty's escalator clause allowed signatory nations to build battleships up to 45,000 tons if other nations exceeded the previous 35,000-ton limit. Japan's withdrawal from the treaty system and evidence that she was building super battleships triggered this clause. The design requirements for Iowa reflected hard-won knowledge from World War I and the interwar years. The ships needed to be fast at least 33 knots to keep pace with the fleet carriers that would form the core of America's naval striking power. They needed to pass through the Panama Canal, which limited the beam to 108 feet. They needed armor sufficient to resist their own 16-inch shells at battle ranges, and they needed endurance to operate across the Pacific without constant refueling. Meeting all these requirements simultaneously was nearly impossible. Armor, speed, and firepower exist in tension. Strengthen one, and you compromise the others, or you build a ship so large it becomes impractical. The North Carolina-class battleships, commissioned in 1941, demonstrated this problem. At 35,000 tons, they were fast, but their armor protection was barely adequate. The South Dakota class, commissioned in 1942, sacrificed length for armor, resulting in ships that were better protected, but cramped, with less endurance. Iowa represented the Navy's decision to build the battleship they actually wanted, escalator clause or not. At 45,000 tons, standard displacement, nearly 58,000 tons fully loaded, she had the size to accommodate both speed and protection. Her machinery spaces housed 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers feeding 4 sets of geared turbines, generating 212,000 shaft horsepower. This was enough to drive her 48,000-ton mass through the water at 33 knots, faster than most heavy cruisers, faster than anything except destroyers and cruisers. In trials, Iowa exceeded 35 knots. In emergency runs during combat operations, she sustained over 30 knots for hours at a time. This speed was not for show. It was operationally essential. The fast carrier task forces operated at sustained speeds of 25 to 30 knots when conducting strikes, positioning for attacks, or withdrawing from danger. Older battleships, the Tennessee class, the California class, even the Colorado class with their 16-inch guns could make only 21 knots. They couldn't keep up. They had to be left behind, relegated to shore bombardment duties or convoy escort, because they couldn't operate with the carriers. Iowa and her sisters could. This meant they were present for every major carrier operation in the Pacific from February 1944 onward. When TF-58, the fast carrier task force, struck the Japanese-held islands, Iowa was there, screening the carriers, ready to intercept any Japanese surface force that tried to close with the vulnerable flatboats. When American forces invaded islands, Iowa was there, providing gunfire support that could reach inland for miles. When the carriers came under air attack, as they did repeatedly during the Marianas Campaign, during later Gulf, during the Okinawa operation, Iowa was there. Her 40mm and 20mm guns adding to the wall of flak that protected the task force. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated this integration of battleships and carriers perfectly. The Japanese had committed the last of their carrier-based air power, over 400 aircraft launched from 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, to a decisive attack on the American invasion of Saipan. They believed they had a numerical advantage and the benefit of land-based air support from airfields in the Marianas. They were catastrophically wrong. American radar detected the Japanese raids while they were still over 100 miles away. Fighter directors vectored F-6F Hellcat fighters to intercept. But the Japanese aircraft that made it through the fighter screen ran into something unprecedented, a coordinated air defense net that integrated 7 battleships, 7 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 13 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers into a single fire control system. Iowa and her sisters were at the center of this defense. Their Mark 37 fire control systems for the 5-inch secondary battery included Mark 12 and Mark 22 radar that could track incoming aircraft at ranges exceeding 20 miles. As Japanese aircraft closed to within range 10 miles, 8 miles, 5 miles, the 5-inch guns opened fire with proximity-fused shells. These weren't shells that had to score a direct hit. They only had to pass within 70 feet of an aircraft. The radar proximity fuse would detect the target and detonate the shell, filling the air with shrapnel. The effect was devastating. Japanese aircraft began exploding in mid-air, often before they could even identify their targets. Those that made it through the 5-inch barrage ran into the 40mm guns, quad mounts, that could fire 120 rounds per minute per barrel, tracking targets with Mark 51 directors that used lead computing gyroscopes. The Japanese called it the Marianas Turkey, shoot. American pilots and gunners shot down over 600 Japanese aircraft in 2 days. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air power was essentially destroyed. It would never recover. Iowa's contribution to this victory was quantifiable. Her gun crews claimed 32 aircraft shot down, a conservative estimate based on confirmed kills aircraft that fell from the sky where observers could verify the destruction. The actual number was likely higher, because in the chaos of battle, with hundreds of aircraft being engaged simultaneously by dozens of ships, attribution became impossible. What matters is that Iowa and her sisters, rather than being obsolete in the age of air power, proved to be essential components of air defense. Their combination of radar-directed fire control, heavy anti-aircraft batteries, and trained crews made them platforms for air defense that complemented and enhanced the carrier's defensive capabilities. This was not what German or Japanese naval strategists had predicted. In their analysis, battleships were targets in an air war, expensive and vulnerable. But American battleships, designed with modern air defense as a primary requirement, proved otherwise. They were survivors, platforms that could take punishment and keep fighting. This was demonstrated most dramatically during Typhoon Cobra in December 1944. The Third Fleet, operating east of Luzon, ran into a typhoon while attempting to refuel at sea. The storm intensified rapidly, with winds exceeding 120 miles per hour and waves over 70 feet high. 3 destroyers capsized and sank. Several escort carriers suffered severe damage. Aircraft broke loose on their hangar decks and caught fire, causing casualties and requiring emergency repairs. Light cruisers took green water over their bows. Fleet carriers pitched so violently that aircraft were torn from their deck parks despite being chained down. Iowa and her 3 sisters weathered the storm with minimal damage. Their size and structural strength allowed them to ride out conditions that destroyed smaller vessels. While destroyers were fighting for survival, Iowa maintained formation, maintained speed, and remained combat-ready. When the storm passed, she was among the ships that searched for survivors from the sunken destroyers. This resilience extended to combat damage. USS South Dakota, while not an Iowa-class ship but sharing many design features, took 42 hits from Japanese shells and bombs during the naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942. She remained operational, fought back effectively, and steamed to a repair yard under her own power. The armor scheme worked. The Iowa-class ships, with even better protection, were designed to survive multiple hits from 16-inch shells. In practice, they never faced such a test, but the protection was there, engineered into every plate and frame. The only Iowa-class ship to take serious combat damage was Iowa herself, and it wasn't from enemy action. On April 19, 1989, during peacetime operations, an explosion in Turret 2 killed 47 sailors. The explosion occurred during a training exercise, caused by an overarm of powder bags that generated enough friction to ignite the propellant. The blast destroyed the gun pit and sent flames roaring up through the turret into the gunhouse. But it didn't destroy the turret. The armor held. The barbette, the armored cylinder that protected the turret's ammunition, hoists and machinery contained the explosion. Fire didn't spread to adjacent compartments. The magazines were flooded as a precaution, but they were never in danger. The ship remained operational, able to fight with her remaining 6 16-inch guns. This was the proof of concept for Iowa's design. Even a catastrophic internal explosion couldn't destroy her. The contrast with enemy battleships is stark. When HMS Hood took a hit from Bismarck that penetrated her magazines, she exploded and sank in under 3 minutes, taking all but 3 of her 1,400 crew with her. When USS Arizona took bomb hits at Pearl Harbor that reached her forward magazines, she was blown apart, taking over 1,100 men to the bottom. Japanese battleships at Leyte Gulf and during the Okinawa campaign absorbed tremendous damage before sinking, but they succumbed to massed air attacks, dozens of torpedoes and bombs, overwhelming their defenses. Iowa-class ships were never tested this way in combat. They were never exposed to the kind of massed air attack that sank Yamato or Musashi. But the one time an internal explosion occurred, an explosion that would have gutted a lesser ship, Iowa contained it, survived it, and could have continued fighting if necessary. The design philosophy worked. This philosophy extended to every aspect of Iowa's construction. Her propulsion system was redundant, 4 separate engine rooms, each with its own boilers and turbines, each capable of independent operation. If 1 or even 2 engine rooms were disabled by damage, she could still make 25 knots or more on the remaining machinery. Her steering system was triply redundant, hydraulic, electric, and manual controls, with connections that could be shifted to use any steering motor from any control station. Her electrical systems were divided into multiple independent networks, each with its own generators and distribution panels. Even her fire control systems were redundant. 2 Mark 38 directors, 2 plotting rooms with separate Mark 8 range keepers, independent radar systems that could cross-connect. If the forward director and plotting room were knocked out, the aft systems could take over, directing fire from all 9 guns. If radar failed, optical systems could still track targets and feed data to the rangekeeper. If the rangekeeper failed, local control from the turrets remained possible, though with reduced accuracy. Every system had a backup, and every backup had a backup. This redundancy was expensive. Iowa cost approximately $100 million to build in 1943 dollars, equivalent to over $2 billion today. Her 3 sisters cost similar amounts. For this price, the Navy could have built several dozen destroyers or several additional fleet carriers. Critics, including some within the Navy, questioned whether battleships were worth the investment. The answer became clear during the Korean War. When North Korean forces invaded South Korea in June 1950, the United States had exactly 1 battleship in active service, USS Missouri, operating as a training ship. By September, with the situation in Korea desperate and United Nations forces pinned into the Pusan perimeter, the decision was made to reactivate USS New Jersey. She was recommissioned in November 1950 and deployed to Korea in May 1951. What New Jersey provided was something no other platform could match: sustained, accurate, long-range fire support. Aircraft from carriers could strike targets, but they couldn't maintain continuous coverage. Artillery could provide sustained fire, but only at ranges under 10 miles. New Jersey could engage targets 20 miles inland, firing hour after hour, day after day, as long as her magazines held ammunition. Her shells were larger and more destructive than anything except strategic bombers could deliver, and she could place them with accuracy measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. UN forces on the ground called New Jersey the Big J, and credited her with breaking up numerous enemy attacks, destroying supply concentrations, and demolishing fortified positions. One Marine officer, writing after the war, estimated that New Jersey's gunfire support during the defense of the Pusan perimeter was worth at least a division of troops, 15,000 men that didn't have to be deployed because the battleship could cover their sector. Iowa, Wisconsin, and Missouri all served tours in Korean waters, providing gunfire support, shore bombardment, and occasional anti-aircraft defense for the fleet. They proved their worth so convincingly that the Navy kept all 4 in reserve after the armistice in 1953, unwilling to scrap ships that had demonstrated ongoing utility. This utility was demonstrated again in Vietnam. In 1968, with the war in Southeast Asia consuming increasing numbers of aircraft and pilots, the decision was made to reactivate New Jersey for shore bombardment duties. She recommissioned in April and deployed to Vietnam in September, taking station in the Gulf of Tonkin. For 9 months, New Jersey pounded North Vietnamese and Viet Cong positions along the coast and inland. Her 16-inch guns could reach targets that were beyond the range of Army artillery, could strike with a precision that aerial bombardment couldn't match, and could do so continuously, in any weather. She fired over 5,600 16-inch shells and 15,000 5-inch shells, millions of pounds of explosives, delivered exactly where ground commanders needed them. The impact on enemy operations was measurable. North Vietnamese after-action reports captured after the war described New Jersey as a strategic threat that forced the relocation of supply routes, command centers, and troop concentrations away from coastal areas. Truck convoys that had previously moved in daylight were forced to move only at night, and only along routes that were beyond New Jersey's range. Artillery positions that had been dug into hillsides within range of American positions were abandoned when New Jersey's shells began demolishing the mountains themselves. One incident, reported in Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, described a Marine patrol that had called in fire support from New Jersey on a Putter, North Vietnamese bunker complex. The first 16-inch shell landed long, overshooting the target by 200 yards. The forward observer made the correction down 200, and the second shell landed directly on target, obliterating the bunker and creating a crater that the Marines later used as a defensive position. The patrol commander was quoted as saying, "I don't care what anyone says about battleships being obsolete. That ship just saved our lives." This was the pattern throughout the Cold War. Every time the question arose, should we decommission the Iowa-class ships, some crisis or conflict would demonstrate their ongoing value. After Vietnam, New Jersey was decommissioned in 1969, and all 4 Iowas sat in reserve through the 1970s. But in the 1980s, the Reagan administration's 600-ship Navy plan called for reactivating all 4 battleships, modernizing them, and returning them to the fleet. The modernization was extensive. The ships retained their 9 16-inch guns. No modern weapon system could match their range and power. But the 5-inch secondary battery was reduced from 20 guns to 12, and the space was used for new weapons: 32 Tomahawk cruise missiles in armored box launchers, 16 Harpoon anti-ship missiles, and 4 Phalanx close-in weapon systems for missile defense. Modern radar, modern communications, modern fire control computers. The Mark 160 digital ballistic computer replaced the mechanical Mark 8 Rangekeeper, though the old system remained as backup. The reactivated battleships proved their worth in Lebanon in 1983, when New Jersey's 16-inch guns provided fire support for Marines conducting peacekeeping operations. They proved it again in 1987 during Operation Earnest Will, when Iowa and Missouri escorted reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through the Persian Gulf, protecting them from Iranian attacks. And they proved it most dramatically in 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, when Missouri and Wisconsin fired Tomahawk missiles and 16-inch shells at Iraqi targets. The footage from Desert Storm is remarkable. Wisconsin, stationed in the Persian Gulf, fires a broadside 9 16-inch guns, the muzzle flash visible for miles, the sound carrying across the water like thunder. The shells arc inland, traveling for over a minute before impacting Iraqi positions 20 miles away. Each shell carries 1,900 pounds of high explosive. Each creates a crater that can swallow a truck. Iraqi forces, already demoralized by weeks of air attack, break and run when the battleship fire begins. They had faced bombs, missiles, aircraft, but nothing prepared them for shells the size of telephone poles, arriving from over the horizon, demolishing fortified positions that had been built to resist anything short of nuclear weapons. This was the final proof that Iowa and her sisters were not obsolete. More than 45 years after they were commissioned, they remained relevant, capable, and feared. The technology that made them revolutionary in 1943, radar-directed fire control, mechanical computers, integrated systems, had been updated but not replaced. The fundamental concept, a fast, heavily armored ship that could project power across great distances, remained valid. The Germans were wrong. The Japanese were wrong. Everyone who predicted the end of the battleship was right for most battleships. But Iowa was not most battleships. She was the culmination of a century of naval engineering, the product of hard-won lessons and brilliant innovation, a ship that demonstrated that even in the age of aircraft carriers and guided missiles, there was still a role for the guns. The irony is that Iowa and her sisters are now museums: USS Iowa in Los Angeles, USS New Jersey in Camden, New Jersey, USS Missouri in Pearl Harbor, moored near the wreck of USS Arizona, the battleship she made obsolete, and the site of the war's beginning and end, joined in a single panorama. USS Wisconsin in Norfolk, Virginia. All 4 ships preserved, no longer capable of fighting but still magnificent, testament to an age when American engineering produced weapons that could not just win wars but redefine how wars were fought. Their guns are cold now. The magazines are empty. The boilers are dark. The engines silent. Visitors walk through passageways where sailors once ran to battle stations, through fire control rooms where computers calculated solutions to destroy ships over the horizon, through turrets where gun crews loaded shells that could level mountains. But the legacy remains. The Iowa-class battleships were the last battleships built, and they were the best battleships ever built. They were faster, more accurate, better protected, and more versatile than any battleship that came before. They fought in 5 wars across 50 years. They sank enemy ships, destroyed fortifications, supported invasions, protected carriers, shot down aircraft, launched missiles, and did it all with an effectiveness that justified every dollar, every hour of construction, every minute of training their crews. They proved that obsolescence is not inevitable, that even a weapon system written off by experts can remain relevant if it's designed properly, built well, and used intelligently. The Germans called battleships obsolete. They were right about most battleships, but they were wrong about Iowa. She and her sisters weren't obsolete. They were revolutionary, and the fact that we remember them today, while Bismarck and Tirpitz and Yamato are footnotes, proves which nation understood the future of naval warfare. The 16-inch guns of USS Iowa hit targets 24 miles away in 90 seconds. That wasn't obsolete. That was unprecedented. And 50 years later, no ship has matched it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.